What happens when they run out, when the weather gets cold?
Well, let me say a few things about this, Joe. First of all, we sadly have a transactional foreign policy. There's not a strategy behind this because President Trump was against it before he was for it, and he was against the Graham-Blumenthal bill before. Now he may let it go through, et cetera, et cetera. What we really need is a strategy around helping Ukraine win a war against an aggressor which violated international law and invaded it 3 years ago. I was critical of the Biden administration for slow-rolling weapons, and I am critical of the Trump administration for letting what seems like rogue elements in the Pentagon disrupt the flow of patriots, which are the critical asset that can protect Ukraine's cities, which are under bombardment from hundreds of drones every single night. So I'm glad that's being restored. When you're asking me what happens when the aid package runs out, Congress needs to act. And the good news is that Congress is actually moving this Graham-Blumenthal bill, which has a veto-proof majority supporting it, over 80 senators out of 100. That is astonishing in these times. And what it would do, I think the Graham bill matters. It will impose crippling sanctions, secondary sanctions, on any countries that trade in fuel and energy with Russia. And that will really hurt Russia's economy and get Putin's attention in a way that sort of softer sanctions haven't. So it's the combo of weapons, defensive weapons, but also permission to Ukraine to attack targets in Russia that are targeting it, plus sanctions.
But when we talk, Jane, about the threat of potentially more crippling sanctions, of more weapons going to Ukraine, those things do not yet seem to be deterring Vladimir Putin at all or changing his behavior. In fact, what we're seeing is intensifying strikes on civilian targets in Ukraine. So what signal is Vladimir Putin receiving from the United States, and does it match the one that you think the U.S. is trying to send?
No, because he's watched Trump. He plays Trump very well, and he has played every U.S. president since 1994 when he agreed that he would recognize Ukraine's sovereignty if Ukraine gave up its nukes. He's violated that, and there have been lots of presidents in both parties since, so let's go there. But I think he doesn't really believe the administration will be tough. I think if the Graham-Blumenthal bill passes, I think if Congress extends a serious aid package to Ukraine, he'll have to believe it. And I also think China has its own issues, and China has been the big aid to Russia. Let's see. But I think Putin could soon discover that he's between a rock and a hard place, and he better be more serious about the U.S. View of Ukraine.
Well, in the meantime, he continues to bomb Ukrainian civilians. It was a brutal night again in Kyiv with people hiding in bomb shelters. You could hear the sound of missiles and low-flying drones for hours through sections of the capital. Jane, this is not somebody who seems to be moved easily. Is there anything Donald Trump could say on Monday that would stop this?
Yeah, I think if he said, I'm all for the Graham bill, it's going to be implemented, I will sign it the minute it passes both houses of Congress, and they can be quick to do things like this when they are motivated. Yeah. And if he says, not only am I sending patriots, but I'm doubling whatever other aid is necessary and on an emergency basis and asking Congress for a big appropriation, I think that will that work? I hope so. I think Putin smells a vacuum right this minute and is doing everything he can to damage Ukraine's cities, and it will. But I have said forever that the strongest weapon in this war is the Ukrainian heart, and they're never going to give up, and they shouldn't give up. And don't we understand that NATO is next? We are members of NATO. I don't think President Trump, no matter what some people are whispering, is going to pull out of NATO or even pull out of our Article 5 obligations for common defense. I don't think that will happen. I don't think Congress will let that happen. And so I think this is Putin's last stand. I surely hope it is. And I hope what comes next is a settlement on Ukraine's terms to this unfair, cruel, ridiculous, unlawful war.
Well, as we talk about the prospect of one war ending, I'd like to ask you about another, Jane, and of course that's the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, as the administration is suggesting we could reach a ceasefire agreement in the coming days. We heard this from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, at a summit in Kuala Lumpur earlier, talking about that.
Well, we're hopeful. I mean, in the end, we're hoping they'll move to proximity talks. It appears that generally the terms have been agreed to, but obviously now you need to have talks about how you implement those terms. And I spoke to Steve Woodcock last night, and he's optimistic that proximity talks will begin fairly soon, expedited and facilitated by the Qataris and the Egyptians.
Jane, as you well know, we've been told that a deal was close before. It's happened repeatedly, and yet deals have not always materialized. Is this time different to you?
Well, let's start with the fact that a ceasefire is not a long-term strategy. It is at least an end of the killing for a period of time, and in the case of Gaza, maybe an exchange of 10 hostages for a number of Palestinian prisoners. There are 20 hostages still alive, reportedly, so there's still 10 to go. But then what? Bibi is, so far as we know, opposed to a state for the Palestinians or a pathway to a state. He wants 5 million Palestinians, 2 million in Gaza and 3 million in the West Bank, to choose where they want to live. Well, what if they choose to live where they live in a state with responsible government? How about that idea? And the same thing is true for Iran. I mean, there's a ceasefire as a predicate to what? How are we going to resolve differences in Israel, too, with Iran? I can't imagine, after watching what is happening to Ukraine, which gave up its nukes in 1994, that Iran is going to want to give up its nukes. It hasn't reached breakout yet, but it's almost nukes in exchange for some countries, not the U.S., I assume, but some countries violating its sovereignty in the future.
So what's more likely, a ceasefire with Hamas or another Israeli strike against Iran?
A parade of horribles. I think a ceasefire with Hamas is the most likely at the moment. I don't know about actions against Iran. If there's evidence claimed by Israel that Iran is proceeding to make a bomb, which it could possibly do, I think the strikes by Israel and our strike have not totally eradicated, or the word is, obliterated Iran's nuclear possibilities. So it may have pushed them to move faster. So there could be more strikes. I somehow don't think that's on the Trump playlist for the moment. I don't think so. There was so much pushback here. It was so unpopular, but it probably is on the Bibi playlist.